lot of the symptoms we suffer from, depression and anxiety and negative self-image and a loss of belief in our own effectiveness, come when we forget that we are telling a story and we believe that we're simply describing reality. We say these things about ourselves, about things we regret or things we believe we're not good at or failures we may have had, and that becomes the story of our lives without our understanding that it is a story and that we could tell a better and different story, and a story that included all the evidence, including the good experiences that we've had and the ways in which we've succeeded. So I think embracing narrative can be a way of escaping these self-fulfilling prophecies. If we believe that we're unlovable and unattractive, we will make it so.
Welcome to the Newsflash Podcast, the podcast you deserve. My name is Jonathan Clarke, and with me is the extraordinarily should I say well-traveled? Are you well-traveled? No, you're not.
More than some, but I don't think I'd consider myself like super well-traveled. No.
Yes. Well, in the one thing of today's wonderful return guest, Jonathan Clarke, I can say asked him if he was well-traveled, and he's like, not really. I've been to 20 countries, and I was like, very, very good.
Yes. See, it all depends on your view, I guess, what you think is well-traveled. But one thing I will say is I feel like doing this podcast is a form of travel, because we talk to people overseas all the time who've had different life experiences and we talk on different topics. So in a way, I feel like this is travel for me.
Yeah. So you like explore bigotry of the world, you know, you talk to, TERFs and just, white supremacists and other. That's what you're telling me.
Yeah,
that
Proud Boys.
Proud Boys. You want to talk to all these people in different countries.
Former Proud Boys, I should say.
Former Proud Boys, but mainly people who are offensive and should be cancelled, and that's what you like, obviously.
It's like some ghastly tour. Like if that was a physical tour, you could imagine the movie it would be. It would be like Sailor or something. You'd go from one awful white supremacist rally to, I don't know, some tortured dungeon somewhere.
Yeah, yes, I can picture it. Am I well traveled? I don't know. I'm not. Embarrassingly, I'm parochial, and I've just like to get away more, but. It's tricky.
It's all about the cash, though. I mean, we would be more well traveled if we had a lot of cash.
Yeah, you're right. That is a big thing now, and with the kid as well. Like, it does change. Like, got this trip.
But again, if you've got the cash, it doesn't matter. The nanny comes with you.
I know, and then you like try and proposition her on the cruise, or is that not? Are we not thinking the?
That's not where I was going, but
yeah, or neither was I. I was just, Anyway, moving on.
Well, if you want to help us with our travel ambitions, you can send us a little cash via the Buy Me a Coffee platform. Any donation there is very much appreciated. But in addition to that, we would love it if you could leave us a rating or review wherever you listen to the show. You can follow us on X and Instagram. We're also on YouTube, so please subscribe to our YouTube channel and leave a comment about a show you liked. Now, word of mouth is also a very powerful tool, so please tell all of your friends, and let's get into it. Return guest Jonathan Clarke is a contributing editor of City Journal. He's a critic and essayist, a lawyer by training and profession. Jonathan has spent more than 20 years working in the New York offices of two large firms. He divides his time between Brooklyn and Vero Beach, Florida. Jonathan, welcome back to the Newsflash.
Thanks very much for having me. It's nice to be with you again.
So, Jonathan, perhaps you could give us a dispatch from New York. It's been a little while since we've caught up. We're interested to hear what New Yorkers are worried about right now from your perspective. Immigration, law and order. What's the scuttlebutt?
Well, I struck a pretty pessimistic note the last time I was here. I complained about the subways and I complained about crime, and there's been some good news since then. Shootings, which were spiking the last time I was here, are under control and actually trending downward in New York. And the federal government and the state of New York stepped in with some funds for the subways, which allowed the subway system to close a pretty significant deficit. Those are both good news. The migrant issue is going to be an ongoing drag on the city's finances. We are spending an enormous amount of money to settle and house the migrants that are coming from the border, and So of course that's money that can't be spent somewhere else, whether it be on housing or other initiatives that the mayor might have in mind. I'm feeling a little bit better than I did when I was with you last, but the problems are significant. I think Mayor Adams has the right agenda. I don't know that he necessarily has the broad support he needs, or frankly the dynamic personality or the energy to carry it off. But I still remain cautiously optimistic about him as a mayor.
Has the immigration issue has it because obviously online the narrative is, oh, you know, the a lot of immigrants have been bust into New York and things like that, and you know this has you know dragged the lefties, you know, into the real world. They've had to get some of their common sense back and react against this. Is that a bit confected in a way, that narrative?
I do think people can see the fiscal impact that this is going to have on the city. And just if you ride the subways, you see women with infants and young children on their backs walking through trying to sell little bits of candy or whatever to raise money. And I think these are recently settled New Yorkers from Mexico and Honduras and places like that. And it's hard for them to uh, get traction in the city. So I think people can see the problem. And I think that Mayor Adams has complained pretty vocally about the drag this is placing on our finances. We like to think well of ourselves in New York in terms of our generosity and the welcome mat that we put out for immigrants. And but the city, of course, does have its limits. And as I say, we have a lot of other uses for that money. So I think right now we're at an inflection point in terms of public sentiment. Everyone wants to be welcoming. Everyone understands why the migrants are coming. On balance, I think Latino immigration works for America and works for New York. But even a dynamic economy like like New York City's, can only absorb so many new faces, and that may be what we're running up against.
Yes, well, it is a big topic, and I'm sure we'll come back to it next time it will roll on next time we chat. But the two pieces we want to talk about today that you've written about, the first one is about travel, which we want to cover first. It's called Over There: Tourism and the Imperial Self. An exploration of which I think it was an exploration of our motivations to travel to far-flung places and whether it's possible to be changed or achieve transcendence by such jaunts. The second piece we're going to dip into is about Freud, and both of these pieces will be available very very soon. We can talk a bit more about that. But firstly, about travel. Jonathan, before we get into some of the details of the piece, are you a well-traveled person? Do you like travel?
I've been a lot of places. I don't think of myself as well traveled for the following reason. I've been to 15 or 20 countries probably, but only usually for a week at a time. And since I'm stuck inside my own language, I don't speak any language but English. I don't know that these week-long visits allow me much access into the cultures that I'm visiting. So I probably come home relatively unchanged. That may have something to do with my temperament. I'm a cautious, uh, narrow kind of person. I don't easily give myself over to the flow of experience, especially as I've gotten older. It's one thing to do that when you're 25. You know, you go someplace and you can go out and you can immerse yourself. But as you get older, you want to stay closer to the hotel. I don't know. Maybe it's just me, but you know, these experiences that people are having where they go and they dance with the native villagers and they smoke peyote with the tribal elders. That stuff's not happening to me. I mean, I'm seem to be tethered to the lobby of whatever nice hotel I'm staying in. And so I don't know that I'm getting as much out of travel as other people are. But extrapolating from my own experience leads me to wonder whether people are having these transformational experiences that they like to tell us about. So your question was, am I well traveled? Yes and no. I've been a lot of places. I've tried to get out of my little bubble, but what I've gained from these experiences, sometimes I wonder.
It's interesting. Your piece sort of grapples with the idea of whether travel is a transformative experience for people, and whether people only see it sort of as transformative in retrospect. When they come home and contemplate things, when they're actually there, their experiences are not great. And I can attest to this too. Like, I went to Europe on a big trip for my honeymoon, and I don't think we quite planned it well enough. We went to too many places and didn't spend long enough in each place, and we wanted to kind of see as much as we could. And I don't think we quite had that immersive experience that we could have had if we just stayed in maybe one or two places. Do you think people are traveling well? There's obviously a technique to it, or there's a way of planning it that makes it better.
I think it's hard to travel well because the places that you visit, especially the well-visited places, Florence and Venice and Paris, they have an agenda for you, and their agenda is around getting the dollars out of your pocket and keeping you within a certain kind of official experience. And I see this when I go around Manhattan and I see visitors from Europe and South America in New York. They're not having an authentic experience of New York for the most part, and they don't look very happy. They look insecure and preyed upon and lost. And unless they know people here who can help them get out of Times Square, I think they go home no wiser than they were when they came, and a good deal poorer. And I can't imagine that I'm having any different experience when I go to these places, to Florence or Berlin or Venice. I have trouble getting out of the well-worn paths that the tourism board has laid out for me. I'm sure there are ways to do it. I don't know that I'm succeeding, and I don't know that most people are succeeding when they travel. I think your point is a good one. It's better to try and have one authentic experience somewhere than to try to do 2 days here and 2 days there. That may be one thing I've learned. I was fortunate enough to spend 28 days in London once. That's the longest experience I've ever had abroad. And by day 21 or 22, I had gone native a little bit. Now, this is an English speaking country, so I didn't have the language barrier. But if you can stay a little while, I think that helps.
Well, here's a quote from your article that pertains to this. Quote: "Most of us have to content ourselves with brief getaways, which often means traveling the well-worn paths. The 6-day, 5-night package tour is one of the signature hustles of modern life, like variable annuities and dietary supplements. It is a conspiracy between the travel company, which wants to sell you an experience as antiseptic and reproducible as mouthwash, and the host cities that want to keep you penned in like a head of beef cattle." Close quote. I think that encapsulates it there. I find myself constantly working when I go on these trips to avoid the cookie cutter experience like you've just described. And I find Times Square to be an existential horror. When I went to New York, it was nightmarish. I just can't, actually, anything like that. I had the same reaction to. Uh, I think there's nothing worse also than realizing when you've been suckered into a tourist trap. The only caveat I'd say to that is in Vietnam, the tourist traps. One of the tourist traps we went to, they let you shoot AK-47s. So if there's an AK-47 involved, I think that sort of changes it a little bit. But mostly, it's pretty boring. But then again, as we've already talked about, the barriers of language and the convenience of these prepackaged experiences are often so great that it's hard to break through. But I also find, I want to get your reaction to this, but I find that when I explain to people, as you just said, you need to maybe know someone from New York to guide you through. But when I explain to someone who's going on a trip, how they could maybe get some real experience and break out of it, I just find that people aren't really interested in hearing about that, and that I come across sounding intense and a bit weird.
One of the themes of my essay, and one of the things that provoked me to write it, was that I'm skeptical of our motives in traveling. I don't know whether Australians are like this. I think Australians might be more authentically interested in the rest of the world. But in America, overseas travel involves a lot of class signaling. It's a strong marker of class status in America. This is a very rich country, and plumbers have a lot of money here, and people that own small businesses have a lot of money. And if you're a college graduate, especially a graduate of a posh college in America, you may strain to signal your class status because you don't have any more money than anybody else does necessarily. And one of the most efficient ways people signal class status in America is with overseas travel, principally to Europe, but for people who really, really want to signal not only their class status, but their enlightenment. Traveling to far-flung places does that very well. And so I wonder, do we want the experiences, or do we just want to talk about having them? Do we just want to tell our friends, oh, I visited Borneo, I visited Sydney, I visited Shanghai? I don't know. I'm skeptical of my own motives, and therefore I'm skeptical of everyone else's motives as well. This is how travel works in America, and I think perhaps England and Australia have more genuine and sincere traditions of travel. But here, first of all, we travel as consumers, as Americans. We want to buy things. We want to flex our muscle economically, and then we want to come home and tell our friends about it. What we do while we're on location almost seems like a secondary thought sometimes.
It's interesting you talk about motivation, and I've got an example here. My wife's friend has been going to Bali on holiday every year for over 15 years. And personally, I'm very interested in the gamelan music of Bali. Although I'm yet to visit Bali myself, I've been studying the music of Bali for 5 or 6 years now. And my wife's friend was oblivious to Bali even having any traditional music and didn't know what I was talking about when I asked her if she's seen any gamelan performances. Now, I found this whole situation frustrating, and it really got me thinking about her motivations. And this is kind of a trope that happens in Australia. We often travel to Bali because it's fairly close, and it's the climate's good. You get lots of cheap stuff. You can get massages for an hour for $5. So I guess going to a country like that and living like a king for a week or so seems to be a motivation of some people in Australia. I mean, are you seeing that sort of thing where people travel to places because it's cheap and they can have this kind of king-like experience?
We do that here. We go to the Caribbean here. We go to Barbados and Bermuda and places like that. And yes, you can pretend that you're a rich person for a week or two. Really, a middle class American can live extraordinarily well in these places and can have servants in one way or another for a week. This is not something that we can afford to do, or that's really within our tradition at home. But it's you can pretend to be the governor of the Raj or something when you travel for a week or two as an American, and these tours are sold to us in that way by Puerto Rico and Barbados and places like that. It's live like a king for a week, and in that circumstance, of course, you're not having an authentic experience at all because you're largely staying inside your luxury hotel and having people bring you cocktails with umbrellas in them and all that. And that's if people want to do that and take it easy for a week and get a suntan, I think that's fine. But that's not travel in the sense that we're talking about. You're not looking for an experience. You're looking for an economic advantage, I think.
Do you think that another aspect to this might be people's aversion to discomfort and misunderstanding? And in one of the quotes from one of the thinkers you mentioned talks about the inability to effectively communicate or to be displaced in an area, and particularly when you're lonely or alone or whatever, is quite a dispiriting experience and troubling. Do you think that package of things is probably something that most people would be trying to stay away from? Even though, I mean, I look at it and I go, well, from my perspective, certain amounts of those things, that's the trip to me. Like, the moments where you've gone out on a limb or been misunderstood or heaven forbid, been bored or made a mistake, gotten lost, I think is the thing. And the horror of getting lost today, I think is palpable. So like the other day I was in the shops with my wife and my child and my father-in-law. we went in separate directions, and I was panicked. We were all calling each other on our phones after 3 minutes, and I was like, imagine if you're in, you're in another country and you're lost. So do you think these sorts of things are a reason why people are like, oh God, I don't want to do that?
Yeah, I think you're onto something. I quoted Paul Theroux, the travel writer, in the article as saying something to the effect that travel is only pleasurable in retrospect, and you hit on this theme earlier. I can remember being in Paris at the famed Longchamp racetrack, and the racing day was over, and my father and I needed to get this was in the pre-Uber days, we needed a taxi to take us back to our hotel. We couldn't figure out how to do it. And so I tried out my French on some race goers, and it was a disaster. People could not have been nicer. The reputation that the French have for rudeness is undeserved in my experience. People were delighted to try to assist us, but my French was so awful that they just eventually they gave me the Gallic shrug and wandered off because I could not make myself understood. I remember this with pleasure because it was funny, and I eventually did get back to my hotel, but in the moment it was uncomfortable. I'm standing there stammering and sweating and making a fool of myself and feeling that I should have stayed home. And why did I believe that I spoke French when evidently I speak no French at all? And so, yes, it's pleasant in retrospect, but at the time it was terrible. And as I've grown older, I'm less and less open to these experiences. And you're right, this is what travel is. Travel is openness to experience positive and negative. We can get on the Viking River longship and have a very curated experience traveling up and down the Danube and never be hot and never be cold and never be hungry and never be unable to find a bathroom and never be misunderstood. And that's not travel. Travel requires of the traveler a certain openness to experience. And perhaps I've just lost that openness as I've gotten older. I do find it more difficult to be good spirited about the inevitable misunderstandings of travel. Maybe this is more of a Jonathan problem than a problem with travel per se. But I'm enjoying my trips less than I used to, and I was wondering why, and that's one of the reasons why I wrote the essay.
Well, interesting. This is fascinating, Jonathan, because I wonder if language is a big part of it, or a deep connection with culture that you develop on the mainland, which you do talk about at the end of your essay. You say maybe I should have just, if you want to learn about French, maybe you should, read about French culture or read about history and connect with it there. I think maybe a combination of the two might be. I think for me, it's about finding a culture that you connect with on a deep level. And for me, it's Japan. I went there maybe 2018 or something. I studied a little bit in high school. Went there in 2018. I had a spiritual moment staring at the city above, and I realized I felt like I was home. You know what I mean? And which is a very strange thing for a painfully white man to say. It makes me sound like all of those embarrassing middle-aged men, like who are interested in, like, Shogun and all that sort of stuff. But I found that interest in the culture and then studying the language. To me, the language is the key, and I always tell people that. I always go, if you can, learning the language or even rudimentary, elementary, whatever, is the difference between you going there and being funneled into some tourist trap. And then I went on a trip alone only a couple of years ago, and I'm not a young man, but I went a couple of years ago alone. A bit difficult now with my wife and my kid, but that trip alone, I had some astounding experiences. I was in a beach town walking. I was just telling Ricky about this, and someone said, "Oh, excuse me, are you lost?" And this guy was taking me back to the train station, just helping me out. And then eventually, I just said to him in his language, I said, "Oh, he didn't seem busy." I said, "Do you want to get a coffee?" And then he said, "Yeah." And then we had a coffee, and we ended up catching up. Another experience from that trip, the World Cup was on, and I just found some bar to go to, and it was like a lock-in that you pay to go in, and Japan was in the World Cup. And that night, I cut to the end of the night, and I'm weirdly friends with all these people in the bar. I mean, So I don't know. I wonder if it's a posture that comes. There are certainly a lot of places that I've been to where exactly as you say, I've just gone, I'm on the outside here and I don't like any of it. but I wonder if, do you think maybe language or a decision, internal decision to go, this is in my year of yes, maybe that could have something to do with it.
I think it has everything to do with it. And as I said, I'm not sure that I'm cultivating the kind of openness to experience that you need to have a good visit to places. I do think it's worthwhile learning at least a little bit of tourist French or Spanish or Japanese if you can, if you have time before you go. I've been sour about travel in this conversation, but I've had some good experiences. Look, I visited Saigon for 5 or 6 days, and it was fantastic. And it could be that Vietnam is new enough as a tourist destination for Westerners that they haven't laid down the tracks yet to keep you within certain kinds of received experiences. Maybe places that are newer as tourist destinations are easier to penetrate. But yes, I mean, part of the problem is one of temperament, that some of us are more open to experience than others. Some of us are willing to take more risks than others. As I said, I'm not having those experiences where I feel that I've gotten past the barriers, but I'm not sure that the problem is with travel as much as it is with my increasing aversion to discomfort, maybe my increasing self-importance. I don't know, but yeah, I wish I was a little bit more open, and I think I would have a better experience. The attitude you take on the airplane with you does make a difference, as you say.
But the perhaps one thing you could do, Jonathan, is not expose your American imperialism by saying Saigon instead of Ho Chi Minh City. That's one
Well,
thing
let me
you could
tell
do.
everyone there says Saigon.
Right.
So if you say Ho Chi Minh City to people in Saigon, they look at you like, that's not to say that they're not. I mean, it's very strange to be there.
The museum. Did you go to the museum?
The Museum of American War Atrocities?
Yes.
I went to the Museum of American War Atrocities. It was 101 degrees. I went to the Museum of American War Atrocities. I wandered out, and then everyone wanted to take their picture with me because actually they love Americans in Saigon.
Yeah.
They, well, love is part of it. They're uh, they remember what happened, of course, and not with any gratitude, I assure you, but with a good deal of probably justified resentment and anger about what happened there, and the role that America played in the Vietnam War. And yet they like Americans. There's some kind of natural affinity between Americans and Vietnamese that I can't explain, but it's definitely there. And I had a marvelous experience being there. The food is really good,
Mm.
and the people are beautiful. And those two things go a long way for me. If you can get a good meal and the people are warm and that helps a lot.
Well, there's another great quote from your piece that I'd like to read out here about Europe and traveling in the 19th century. So, quote, beginning in the late 19th century and continuing through World War II, wealthy young Americans packed steamer trunks and took the grand tour, which typically began in London, traversed the continent, and ended perhaps in Greece. Americans still travel to Europe in enormous numbers, but I suspect that so Eurocentric an itinerary would now be seen as morally naive. What's really chic is to visit some secondary or tertiary nation of Asia or Africa, or to live among indigenous people, perhaps to build them a well or a sturdy schoolhouse, perhaps. End quote. I love this idea of the grand tour. You know, what do you think these 19th century American travelers got out of this tour, and what do you think a modern American would get from it?
The grand tour was really a leisure class tradition, so it was something that you did when you were just out of school or perhaps when you were just married. And this was for people who didn't work. So they could go for 6 months and they could pack a lot of steamer trunks and take their maids or valets with them. What they got out of it, I don't know. Again, class signaling is part of it. But seeing the world was harder in those days. It took a long time to get anywhere, and you might get one trip in your lifetime, even for a relatively affluent person. So for them to take 6 months and see everything once, I suppose, made a kind of sense. It's so different now. I can be in London in 7 hours if I leave for Kennedy Airport right now. And so as a middle class person, I can travel in a way that was only available to very rich people in the late 19th century. What we get out of it now, I don't know. Perhaps the convenience of travel takes some of the allure away or makes it seem more common or domesticated. The grand tour tradition is dead now. People are traveling, I suppose, in different ways, and maybe they're seeking different things.
When I think of the Grand Tour, I think of like Henry James, novels, and I think there's even one sort of novella or is it short story where you're on one of these tours with a character. I forget the name, but speaking of the Eurocentrism that I think comes up in this, it's so fascinating how influential Europe has been to England and America, and how unfashionable that is now. I mean, you could just take. We just spoke about languages. Look at. I feel like if you had if you were teaching French or German at a school today, there'd be questions, about about that. Even here, like people would be like, the connection that we had with Europe. Because I mean, I suppose there's a flattening. You can tell us what you think, but there's the intersectional flattening of European or just into this category of white is so interesting because as you would discover coming here or going to America or going to England for your 28 days, it was a markedly different culture. Am I right?
Different from America? Yes. I mean, subtly different, but it would take a long time to feel at home, that's for sure.
Mm. Yeah. Well, it seems that this connection with Europe has been, I don't know, like forcibly uh, b- broken.
Demographic change in America means that people of European ancestry are now no longer the majority in the United States. And among younger people, that's especially true. And so I suppose it's natural that rather than looking back to Europe as Americans of European ancestry once did, that more and more people will look back to the places that their families came from. So part of this is just a natural shift in demographics and affinities and all that. But yes, because of anti-colonialist narratives that are dominant in American culture right now, on the left more than on the right, Europe is suspect, and people are not necessarily anxious to invoke their European heritage. And in fact, one of the things you see now is in North America, and I'm not sure if this happens in Australia, but people are periodically outed in North America for claiming indigenous ancestry that is not authentic.
Pocahontas, as
Yeah,
as the Donald
yeah,
famously said.
yeah.
Don't they call them pretendians?
I'm not a Donald Trump fan, but Pocahontas was a pretty good shot that he took at Elizabeth Warren. I did think that was funny. There have been a number of these cases now of academics who are teaching Native American studies, tenured professorships, and it's found ultimately that they grew up in families of European ancestry and have no authentic connection. No, there's no reason why a person of European ancestry couldn't teach Native American studies in principle. But this is where you get into the identity trap. Once you claim it, once you say, "Oh, I'm of indigenous ancestry," then you're vulnerable to being called out. And it's interesting that people are in flight from their European ancestry to a certain extent. I wonder whether that's something that's going to stay with us, or maybe that's uh, a high tide that will ebb a little bit. And as we move out of this particularly fraught political moment in the United States, maybe we can get past the identity politics a little bit. This is something we talked about last time, but yes, we have had these cases in America of people claiming to be African American or claiming to be Native American in order to get some kind of advantage in their professional lives or culturally or just to signal their own virtue, I suppose. It's a odd phenomenon.
Yes. Well, in the meantime, hopefully it is a high tide, as you say, Jonathan. And in the meantime, I think we should travel more and certainly get more uncomfortable. But in the time we've got left, we're going to make a hard pivot from the external to the internal. Head towards the mind. Now you've got an interest in psychoanalysis, and you've been writing about it recently. Written an essay which we've talked about, just one. But I have to ask, what is your interest in psychoanalysis? And because you do come across as someone who's more than a casual fan. I think Freud got a mention in the travel essay that we mentioned. He came up, so perhaps you could start there.
My day job when I'm not writing is that of a lawyer in a large firm in New York. I've done this work for more than 20 years now. And a few years ago, I got a little bored with what I was doing as a lawyer, and I flirted with the idea of changing professions. There is a psychoanalytic institute in Union Square in New York that's walking distance from my office. So out of curiosity and boredom, I walked down there and started taking some classes. I'd been a casual reader of Freud and commentary about Freud for a long time. There was something about Freud and about the culture of psychoanalysis that I found attractive and even seductive. So I started to take these classes and was drawn for a time deeper and deeper into this world of psychoanalytic studies. It's an unfashionable intellectual tradition now in the United States, but there are still these psychoanalytic institutes in major American cities, New York and Washington and Boston and Seattle and elsewhere, where you can go and study. And some of them will train people outside uh, medicine and social work. So, look, I'm a lawyer. All I have is a law degree. They were willing to train me. And for a time, I really considered shifting to be an analyst as my professional work, and ultimately I gave it up. But I was drawn deep enough into the culture, and it left enough of a mark on me that I wanted to write about it and try to make some sense of it.
Now, is there a meaningful difference between a psychologist, therapist, and a psychoanalyst? Because these terms, they seem interchangeable, but I feel like this is not the case. And most of my exposure to this comes from the '90s sitcom Frasier. So, excuse me if if this is a basic question.
I think Frasier was a psychoanalyst, or was at least analytically trained, because he made some Freud jokes in the show, if I remember correctly. So psychoanalysis is just one tradition, one psychotherapeutic tradition. It was the dominant tradition in America for about 30 or 35 years. After World War II, most psychiatrists who were training and doing residencies were trained in Freudian ideas. That's less true now, much less true now. And there are competing traditions. Cognitive behavioral therapy is now the dominant tradition in American psychotherapy. So yes, I agree. It's a lot of acronyms, and for the casual observer, it can be hard to tell the difference. But if we think of psychoanalysis as being associated with Freud and with a few core ideas about the mind and about our mental processes and the way we form identities, we can talk about what those are. But yes, it's a formerly dominant tradition in American psychiatry that is now uh, somewhat unfashionable.
But if we're to believe what Hollywood puts out, everyone in America has a therapist. Do you know a lot of people with therapists or psychologists?
In New York, almost anyone of a certain class status has been to therapy, or is on their way. I mean, they're either coming from their therapist or they're on their way if you meet them on the street. So, yes, I mean, I can't imagine that people in Omaha, Nebraska, are going to the psychotherapist a lot. But in urban centers, it's something that's very openly discussed and very widely accepted, and almost a rite of passage for young adults in cities like this. There's no stigma associated with it in a place like New York. Again, it might be different elsewhere.
And again, is that a class thing? Is that signaling your class that you're on your way to the therapist?
It is signaling your class in part because it can be pretty expensive to go. Psychoanalytic treatment is typically not covered by insurance, or is covered only to a very limited extent, after which you can be paying anywhere from $75 up to $350 for a 45-minute session in a city like New York. Most people can't afford it. So, yes, treatments like CBT, which are covered by insurance, are affordable for ordinary working people. but these more bespoke kinds of treatments that people sometimes pursue require real resources.
Well, you mentioned CBT there. How is that different from psychoanalysis?
The insurance companies like CBT because it's focused on symptoms and it's focused on returning the patient to work and social life as efficiently as possible. The CBT practitioner isn't necessarily going to ask about your relationship with your mother, which is the classic Freudian move. And they're not necessarily interested in the deepest sources of your interpersonal conflicts. They're really interested in identifying what are the cognitive errors that you're making right now that are leading you to unhappiness or to a negative self-image. They want to challenge those thoughts and they want to correct them as quickly as they can. So, for instance, if I believe that nobody likes me or I'm unpopular or I'm obnoxious to people, the psychoanalyst might want to look at my childhood experiences, particularly my relationships with my parents, to see how an attitude like that was formed. How did I form this belief about myself that seems so unshakable, even in the face of evidence to the contrary? The CBT practitioner is going to be focused on taking apart this implicit claim that I'm making. Nobody likes me. I'm unpopular. I'm obnoxious, and push me for evidence that that claim is true. And it may be that the evidence doesn't support the claim, and then we can take it apart and get me back to a more reality-centered view of who I am and what my experiences are. So CBT promises essentially the same kind of relief. CBT is a tradition that is derived from psychoanalytic ideas in part, but it promises the same kind of results and the same kind of relief from neurosis without necessarily the heavy lifting and the expense and the time investment of psychoanalysis.
3 sessions a week, I believe. That sounds like a lot.
3 sessions a week is a lot. I have friends that go 5 times a week here in New York. People that are
Wow.
people that are really devoted to analysis and really believe in it. It's a different kind of conversation if you're going 5 times a week. I think you're almost looking for a witness at that point. Someone, our relationships can be pretty transitory, especially in a city like this where people come and go. We move jobs a lot as Americans. We relocate for work and for school. And so there may be no one in your life who has seen you and known you over a long period, except perhaps your parents, or if your parents are gone, someone you went to school with. But we suffer from a lack of these relationships, and it can be deeply meaningful for people, even if they're not getting better in any traditional way, even if they're not less neurotic, even if they're not doing better at work or enjoying fulfilling romantic relationships. The analyst, I think, is providing something that would normally be provided in a healthy communal life that a lot of Americans just aren't getting anymore. And so the analyst at least is there every Wednesday at 2 or every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 2, and he or she can bear witness, if nothing else. I really feel that there's a hole that psychoanalysis is filling right now that is somehow attuned to this cultural moment. And that may be why psychoanalysis is having a little bit of a comeback or a little bit of an intellectual vogue in places like New York and Boston and Chicago and Seattle, because we're suffering from a particular kind of spiritual deficit that psychoanalysis promises to address.
Well, if you are going five sessions a week, I mean, that's a lot. As a patient, I could see that you could fall into a trap where you end up thinking that your therapist is a good friend of yours and that you might hang out, after the session, or you might get a little bit more involved than just this sort of patient-doctor relationship. And it reminds me of a 90s film starring Bill Murray, which I was obsessed with as a kid, called What About Bob, which is basically that happens. This Bill Murray character, he goes from therapist to therapist, and he ends up, trying to form this friendship with them, and the therapist, they don't want that, and they can't get rid of him, and so they try and sort of handball him off to the next therapist. And do you see that sort of happening, where people sort of end up, thinking they're in a different sort of relationship with their therapist than because the therapist is obviously trying to keep it more professional, perhaps.
The business of the patient's feelings about the analyst and their affection for or resentment of or romantic attachment to the therapist is actually one of the bits of data that the therapist can use in the treatment. So one of the core tenets of analysis is that the patient is going to project onto the analyst certain qualities or attributes that have nothing to do with the analyst and his or her actual person, but that have to do with the patient's prior experiences of love and family and friendship and so forth. And this is information that the analyst can use. I think can be a mixed motive. If the analyst is doing his or her job, they are drawing that boundary and they're reminding the patient of what kind of relationship this is exactly. I said to my analyst once, I feel that I'm having trouble expressing myself to you honestly because I'm worried that if I say ugly things or reveal the truth about my twisted personality, you won't like me anymore. And she waited a beat and said, "What makes you think I like you?" Which was a useful and bracing reminder that we were not friends. And whether she liked me or not was actually not even relevant to the experience we were having. And we laughed about it. And actually, I searched our prior sessions in vain for evidence that she did like me, and I came up with very little. But I was able to express myself more honestly after that because, first of all, I realized that we weren't friends, and second of all, she's heard everything already. So there's nothing so ugly or shameful that I could express that she hasn't heard from others. But yes, of course, if people are feeling lonely or disconnected, and as I posited, the analyst is providing this somewhat synthetic or spurious sense of connection, the analyst may be reluctant to disrupt that, both because it may be a bad idea for the patient to do it, or it has to be done delicately, but also at $3.25 an hour, you'd like the person to keep showing up. So if they want to be your friend, then maybe you let them be your friend. I don't know. Financial incentives are an uncomfortable part of the patient-analyst dynamic, and people that are critical of psychoanalysis and of the whole psychiatric edifice in America often point to these financial incentives as a reason why the relationship may not be the one you think you're having.
We are told, particularly since COVID, I guess, that there's an epidemic of mental illness and depression, across the world, really, but definitely in places like Australia and the US and whatnot. Now, the essay that we've read begins with a rather shocking, in a shocking way. You say several analysts affiliated with leading New York psychoanalytic institutes committed suicide during the pandemic lockdowns of 2020 and 2021. One of these was a highly regarded teacher and analyst who has been affiliated with two such institutes, including one for a time, which I took classes, close quote. So that's the place that you mentioned. But that is that's a hard open, I think, for that piece. Have you ruminated or meditated on why, what's going on here? I mean, why are these it was more than one psychoanalyst that committed suicide. Am I right?
You're right. I ultimately, you are quoting from a draft version of the essay. Ultimately, in the published version, I tacked away from that hard open and didn't wind up talking about suicide as much, in part because psychoanalysis has very little useful to say about suicide. Freud's theory of suicide was that it was introjected hostility. So we commit suicide when we actually want to murder someone else and are inhibited by cultural norms from doing so, and we turn that violent impulse on ourselves, which I think is nonsense,
Exotic.
really. And yeah, I don't think that's what's going on. And subsequent psychoanalytic writers have written on analysis, and I just don't think that the analytic tradition has much that's useful to say about suicide as a phenomenon. I think psychoanalysts are human beings suffering from the same vulnerabilities as the rest of us, and so yes, there were several prominent suicides, including One at the institute where I had taken classes of a young, very well regarded and very talented young guy who died by his own hand during the pandemic. One of my motives in writing the essay was to solve, in quotes, for myself at least, what had happened to this man who I had found such an intellectually dynamic and attractive personality. In the end, I took all that stuff out of the essay because we just couldn't anonymize him enough so that he would not be identifiable uh, to readers who were curious about who he was. He's only been dead 18 months or 2 years, and I just didn't want to subject his family to having him possibly identified by readers of the essay. So ultimately, I took that material out, although it did provide a point of entry, and suicide is something that's on the rise in the United States. It's one of a cluster of mental health problems, along with anxiety and depression and other forms of self-harm, drug addiction. It's hard to know whether these are all one problem or several distinct problems. But when you talk about suicide, it's a way of getting people's attention. And most of us know families that have been affected by suicide, and it sort of centers the problem for people. So that's why I opened with the problem of suicide in my draft, even though I ultimately took it out.
Well, a lot of Sigmund Freud's theories have been debunked, but as a cultural icon, a lot of his ideas have made their way into the wider cultural landscape to the point where, people use phrases like "stop projecting on me," or perhaps John's favorite, "sometimes a cigar is just a cigar." Not even knowing where they come from, does Freud hurt the continued progress of the psychoanalyst movement?
Well, Freud as a person is both the greatest asset that psychoanalysis has because of his intellectual and cultural celebrity. And yes, he's also an impediment to the growth of psychoanalysis for that very reason. I think it might be useful for psychoanalysis to move past Freud, or at least to engage in some sharper critique of Freud, or be more willing to talk about where Freud was wrong. But the risk in that is that by de-romanticizing him or taking him off his pedestal, you also lose some of the cultural energy around psychoanalysis in the broader public. So I think within analytic communities, people feel free to pick and choose what of Freud they believe in and what they don't believe in. But Freud as a celebrity remains important to analysis as a profession, I think. And yes, I think you put your finger on it. I think he is something of an obstacle.
It's interesting,
There
though.
are
Sorry, Jonathan. We don't judge Michael Jordan on all the shots he missed. Do you know what I mean? And he missed a lot. So
Yeah.
there are so many things that this man contributed. I mean, there's bonkers stuff in there, but there's a core set of ideas that are beyond legendary. There are storytelling that is just cuts through cultures, and that we can try and understand ourselves and other people. And I just feel like I don't know. Like, I feel like Woody in Manhattan, right? Like, he's walking down the street, and the Diane Keaton and her partner are just bagging out everyone that he loves. They're like, "Oh, Norman Mailer," and they're just going. And I feel like Freud would be in that list too. And Woody's just going, "I don't know. I think I love all those people you just mentioned." Like, so that's how I feel like Woody in that scene. About Freud. I think he's great. I think these things are solid gold. I mean, can we improve them? Yes, but there's some of them are just so perfect even today.
Well, that's right. And there's a reason why a lot of intelligent people are still drawn to Freud. He's an enormously engaging and seductive and charming writer. So when you engage his ideas firsthand, he is attractive. And the explanatory power of some of the core concepts remains very strong. It's easy to pick on him because there are 3 or 4 ideas that we could talk about, penis envy and other things that seem pretty risible now. But yes, the core concepts are interesting and are worth talking about. I think Freud is almost as useful as a philosopher or as a literary figure as he is as a psychotherapeutic figure. It may be that there are cultural dividends to be gained from reading Freud, or philosophical dividends to be gained from reading Freud, above and beyond what may be going on in treatment rooms. That's my thesis anyway.
Well, I think that you also say in your essay, you say that, like, if we're still, let me just see if I can find it here. It was a great little quote. If we're still arguing about Freud, it is aptly because nothing very satisfying has come along to replace him. As we say, Freud might have some outdated ideas, but the drugs we've ushered in to fill his place have not proved to be that successful. You talk about that in your essay. Do you want to elaborate, perhaps?
Well, in the late 80s and early 90s, when the first SSRIs came on the market, we really thought they were potentially a magic bullet for the treatment of major depression. And there's an American analyst, a trained Freudian, in fact, Peter Kramer, who's a professor at Brown University here, who wrote a book called Listening to Prozac that became an enormous bestseller in America, in which he recounted these extraordinary anecdotes of people suffering from really crippling depression who had come to him and had been resistant to traditional talk therapy treatments, and who experienced astonishing recoveries using Prozac. And then, as Prozac was subjected to more and more double-blind studies, it was found that the effect of Prozac was limited. Not everybody gained any benefit. Some people gained transitory benefit. Some people suffered some symptom relief, but not complete relief. And so the hope that was invested in Prozac and in the SSRIs as a class by the psychiatric community and by people suffering from major depression, which amounts to many millions of people in a country the size of the United States, proved to be a little bit of a false hope. And so we had to reset a little bit and try to think about other ways to treat major depression and anxiety and other common psychiatric illnesses. It looks like Prozac and other SSRIs like Zoloft and Paxil, and people will have heard these names. They're not useless, but they certainly are nothing like a useful treatment for everyone. And to that extent, there was a sort of a boom and bust cycle around the SSRIs.
Well, there's this fantastic quote from that you have in the piece. It's from a modern psychoanalyst who I'd never heard of, but his book sounds absolutely fascinating. Stephen Gross. In your piece, this quote here, this really struck a chord with me. Quote: "All sorrows can be born if you put them into a story, or tell a story about them. But if we cannot find a way of telling our story tells us. We dream these stories. We develop symptoms, or we find ourselves acting in ways we don't understand." Close quote. I thought this was the nub of it, really, and maybe it's certainly why I'm still allured by The Talking Cure. What are your thoughts on this? How important is storytelling to our ability to function, to keep on going in the face of horror and despair?
Stephen Gross is a British analyst, and the book I was quoting from there is called The Examined Life, which is a marvelous collection of clinical vignettes. It was a bestseller here in America. I'm not sure if people remember it anymore. The book's probably 20 years old now. But yes, I think that a lot of the symptoms we suffer from, depression and anxiety and negative self-image and a loss of belief in our own effectiveness, come when we forget that we are telling a story and we believe that we're simply describing reality. We say these things about ourselves, about things we regret or things we believe we're not good at or failures we may have had, and that becomes the story of our lives without our understanding that it is a story and that we could tell a better and different story, and a story that included all the evidence, including the good experiences that we've had and the ways in which we've succeeded. So I think embracing narrative can be a way of escaping these self-fulfilling prophecies. If we believe that we're unlovable and unattractive, we will make it so. Unconsciously, we will behave in ways that drive others away and that frustrate our desires. If we can embrace the idea that the story can be different, that we can select different facts or tell it in a different way, I think it's liberating, and I think we can open up our experience to new interpretations and maybe to a more effective, more gratifying way of being in the world. That's Gross's idea, I think.
Well, I think maybe that's a very apt way to end this interview. As sadly we're out of time, I think that idea about storytelling is so important to us, and I think I think we need to give it a little bit more weight in our lives. The way we approach how we think about our own situation. Yeah, if we can couch it in a story that helps us deal with the sorrows, I think that could really help. Before we wrap up, I'd love to know if you're a Frasier fan, because both John and I we're fans of the sitcom, and we've actually started watching the new season, which I don't know, I'm a bit lukewarm on at the moment, but I've only seen the first episode. So,
well, I loved Frasier in its first incarnation. I haven't seen the new version. I mean, Kelsey Grammer is a very appealing performer. His life off screen has been has not been an easy one.
And I
understand
and Playmates.
Yes, I mean, look, if you're going to have shortcomings, those would be the ones I recommend. Certainly, you're getting good value for money with Booze and Playmates, right? But I haven't seen the new version. I'm interested. I don't know if it's on Netflix or where I would find it. But yes, Paramount Plus. Okay, so not easy to find, but yes, I loved the show the first time around.
Well, we do have a final question that we ask all of our guests, and we'd like to know what you're reading right now.
So I've agreed. I'm not quite done with Psychoanalysis. Apparently, I agreed to write an essay for a magazine called The Smart Set, called Janet Malcolm and the Culture of Psychoanalysis. I don't know how many of your readers would remember Janet Malcolm, who was a New Yorker writer who died about a year ago, actually. She wrote about analysis often, a couple of books about psychoanalysis, and psychoanalytic concepts are threaded through all of her marvelous work. And so the essay is about trying to use psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic concepts as a way of unlocking the meaning and purpose of her work. So I'm going back over, she published probably 18 or 20 books in her life. I'm going back through her work and making notes for that essay. So yes, it's a big stack of Janet Malcolm on my side table right now.
Fantastic. We look forward to reading that, and I'm sure that'll send me down a similar rabbit hole as your writing tends to do.
Well, I recommend Janet Malcolm, whether people are interested in psychoanalysis or not. She's a marvelous writer, and her books are short and accessible, but very sharp, very intelligent, and I think people would be pleased if they picked her up.
Well, just before we wrap, we are coming up to the Christmas season. Have you put aside anything to read over the holidays? Something big and scary?
I don't know if I've picked up anything big and scary. I'm one of these people that goes on Amazon and in a flurry, I order 4 or 5 books, and by the time they arrive, I can't remember what the original impulse was for the purchase. So I have a stack of things. I don't know. I would like to read more fiction. I feel that American fiction's in a little bit of a dead spot right now, but I don't know whether that's true or whether I'm just not engaged enough. There's a book, not a new one, but a book by an American novelist called Colson Whitehead, who wrote about his experience trying to play professional poker. It's called The Noble Hustle. Some magazine gave him $10,000 to go down to Atlantic City and try to play in poker tournaments. And he wrote a memoir about it. I think that might be good fun.
Great. Fantastic.
Sounds interesting. Well, Jonathan, thanks so much for coming back on the show. It's always delightful chatting with you. If people want to find your writing, what's the best way to do that?
So I do have a website. It's called JonathanClarkeWriter.com. And substantially everything I've published is linked to on that site. There are also good audio versions of some of the articles read by a very talented guy named Eric Jason Martin, who's a frequent presenter for Amazon and elsewhere. So that's a nice way to engage with the work, especially the longer stuff. But yes, JonathanClarkeWriter.com, and I'm happy to have people go there and browse. That's the whole point of the site.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Jonathan, and we look forward to catching up with you in the new year sometime.
Thanks so much, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the New Flesh podcast. If you like our work, please consider rating us on Apple Podcasts or even writing us a review. It really does help the show reach a wider audience. We'll be back with another episode next week. Until then, long live the New Flesh.